Rumors of a wagon train disappearing from southern Utah began to spread. Whispers passed at way stations, through settlements, and from traveler to trader that an entire immigrant party of men, women, and children were dead. An event of such magnitude that no amount of sworn secrecy could keep it from the world. You're listening to True Crime of the Historical Kind. This is the conclusion of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, Part 3, The Long Reckoning. If you missed Part 1 or 2, make sure to go back and listen there first. Reportedly, John D. Lee was devastated by learning that his superior and prophet Brigham Young wanted to let the wagon train go in peace. Or he realized he would not be supported in the warlike attack the men of southern Utah decided to inflict upon a domestic party simply trying to pass through. But what had been done in Mountain Meadows could not be undone. All they could hope for was that the truth could be contained, or at least repurposed. News of the event was immediately sent by courier to Brigham Young in Salt Lake. Not surprisingly, the messages placed the blame squarely on the Paiutes. In late September, just weeks after the massacre, John D. Lee traveled north to Salt Lake to speak with the prophet himself and deliver his account. There are discrepancies on what was said in this meeting and when it even took place, but ultimately, it's believed Lee expanded on what the letters already stated, that responsibility lay with the Paiutes. We cannot know what was truly said behind closed doors that day, but historians largely agree that Lee was omitting the Mormon involvement, the coordinated attacks, and the betrayal of the white flag. Likely, this was to protect both himself and higher authorities. It's thought that, at least initially, Brigham Young accepted this version of events, but he would no doubt be concerned with how this event would be taken by the U.S. government. So he publicly accepted Lee's account, but quietly directed people to gather more information. By late 1857, Young submitted an official report to the U.S. Commissioner of Indian Affairs. His internal investigation stated that the massacre occurred from native retaliation, provoked by the supposed poisoning of a spring. This report would be the foundation of the church's public position for years to come. Brigham Young's role as prophet was to put his people first, even if that protection required silence, misdirection, or delay. But what had happened at Mountain Meadows was too large, too brutal, and too visible to fully control. News of a missing wagon train was already being shared in California newspapers by early October. Soon it was confirmed dozens of families were killed, though it wasn't completely clear at first how this happened and who was responsible. The story was shocking, even by frontier standards. The relatives of the Baker-Fancher party back in Arkansas were outraged and demanded answers. But information was only slowly trickling through headlines. And despite the church's stance that the massacre was native violence, the public was not convinced. Mormon communities found themselves once again on the defensive. Brigham Young urged restraint to his people. He instructed his followers to avoid inflammatory statements or actions, especially anything that might escalate tensions with native tribes or federal authorities. Mormons had already developed a persecution complex. Some of that was completely rational, yet in this situation, they took outrage and disgust towards them as more unfair attacks made by people who didn't understand them and couldn't value their divine purpose. This state of mind can act as a powerful shield, a way to reject criticism while maintaining a unified front. It was nothing new for newspapers to portray Mormonism as secretive, authoritarian, and fundamentally un-American. That had been going on for years, so to the average Latter-day Saint, this just seemed like more of the same. Yet to much of the American public, Mountain Meadows appeared to confirm their worst fears. If polygamy, defiance of federal authority, and the creation of a theocratic territory wasn't enough to justify military intervention, what about mass murder? While government officials were suspicious of Mormon involvement, they couldn't act just yet. It was too difficult to find evidence and investigate with the instability of the Utah War still looming over the territory. The U.S. Army had been delayed through the brutal winter of 1857, but finally entered Utah Territory in the summer of 1858. Their arrival was not the violent confrontation many Mormon leaders had feared and prepared for. There was no battle. They simply negotiated, and soon it was decided that Brigham Young would agree to step aside. Federal authority was formally restored with the appointment of Alfred Cumming as the new territorial governor of Utah. So, just like that, the Utah War came to an anticlimactic end. Now that federal authority had been settled, the government could turn its attention to the matter of Mountain Meadows. In March of 1859, a federal judge named John Cradlebaugh convened a grand jury to investigate the massacre. He pursued the case aggressively, even charging that Brigham Young was an accessory before the fact. But his bench was in Provo, Utah, one of the chains of settlements running south from Salt Lake. Local juries would, of course, need to be drawn from Mormon communities, and in reality, there was no way anyone would indict any of their leaders, let alone their prophet. Mere cooperation was difficult. Mormons had been instructed to keep to themselves and to not implicate fellow church members. Arrest warrants were issued for John D. Lee, Isaac C. Haight, and others in connection to the massacre, but they promptly fled Utah Territory to evade legal consequences. In May of 1859, nearly 2 years after the killings, Major James Henry Carleton of the U.S. Army conducted the first thorough federal examination of the massacre site. What he found was horrifying. The meadows had been largely untouched. Bones still laid scattered across the ground. They had been bleached by the sun, gnawed by animals, and clearly left unceremoniously. Carleton concluded that the massacre was a heinous crime and rejected the claim that it had been carried out solely by the Paiutes. He believed that the evidence pointed unmistakably to organized participation by white settlers. Carleton's men gathered what remains they could. They buried 34 victims beneath a stone cairn, bearing the inscription, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." It was the first official acknowledgement on the ground itself that what had occurred was not a frontier skirmish, but a massacre. At the same time, a parallel investigation was underway. The federal superintendent of Indian Affairs for Utah was a man named Jacob Forney. He began traveling through southern settlements, attempting to reconstruct what happened in the days after the killings. Forney dismissed the long circulating rumors that the Baker Fancher party had poisoned springs or were deliberately provoking Mormon settlers. He concluded that Paiute involvement, while real, had been instigated and directed by white settlers, not driven by independent native aggression. But Forney's most urgent task was to find the survivors. For 2 years, the 17 children were scattered among Mormon households across southern Utah. He used local help, most notably by James Hamlin, to reconstruct who took the children, but accounts varied. One by one, Forney found each child. And I do need to correct what I said last episode that all the siblings were separated. There were a few found together. Forney initially reported that the children were doing better than the surrounding Mormon children, yet later accounts would say that they were treated like indentured servants. He inquired to each family how they came to house the survivors. They all said the same thing, that they traded goods with Paiutes to take them in. When it was clear Forney intended to intervene and reclaim the children, some of the families even wanted ransoms, but most wanted some form of repayment. Once Forney could interview the older children, the dark truth of their circumstance began to come to light. And what they had to say was truly horrific. Forney took notes about each child. Here's one such account. First, boy named Calvin, does not remember his surname, is between 7 and 8, was near his mother when she was killed, and says he pulled arrows from her back until she was dead. Does not know what became of his father, Calvin had two brothers older than himself, named James and Henry, and three sisters, Nancy, Mary, and Martha. He was obtained by Mr. Hamblin from E.H. Groves of Harmony. Groves says he paid to the Indians for Calvin a horse for $70. He charges for schooling and maintenance, $75. John Calvin, the above-named boy, assures that he never lived among the Indians. That seemed to be a running theme. In another excerpt, Jacob Forney said this: "In connection to the older children, they told me none of them have ever lived with the Indians, and also that at the massacre there were about 30 or 40 white persons present. They also told me that they were in the corral fighting. Some said 4 and others 6 days, and that part of the time they had no water. They also told me that John D. Lee and others came in 2 wagons and got their fathers to go with them, and that they saw them when the Indians were killing them." To find the discrepancies between what the older children remembered and what the foster families were saying seemed to be signs of a cover-up. Forney would go on to report his findings to his superiors and take custody of the children. He arranged for their removal from Utah. They used part of the military fund, and under military escort, the children were transported east, passing through Fort Leavenworth and returned to surviving relatives in Arkansas. The return of the surviving children became national news. Although they were still very young, the older of the children recounted the harrowing events of the meadows. They told of the cold brutality upon the women and children, watching their families die in front of them, then being forced to live among the Mormons as if nothing happened. As they got older, they'd be able to articulate their experiences more fully, which we will get to a bit later. But for Americans already critical of Mormonism, these accounts confirmed their abhorrence to the religion. It's safe to say, for a territory angling for statehood, public relations could not have been worse. But actual accountability was still out of reach. As the 1860s dawned, national priorities shifted dramatically. With the outbreak of the American Civil War, the federal investigation was effectively halted. Prosecuting a massacre in a distant Western territory became politically impossible while the nation fought itself. Back in Utah, many had felt like the massacre was in the past. Around 1861, the rock cairn erected by Major Carleton was destroyed, likely by local residents. Though in 1864, passing U.S. soldiers rebuilt a smaller memorial at the site, but that would be the only respect given for now. Utah Territory remained its own desert island of sorts, but Western expansion was inevitably roping them into the Union, as railroads were stitching the east and west sides of the country together. The frontier, once lawless and free, was increasingly being drawn into the American legal and political order. Utah continued to petition for statehood, but there would be several hurdles they'd need to cross to make a successful bid. Issues of polygamy, the entanglement of church and state, and the unresolved tragedy at Mountain Meadows. Over the years, Brigham Young quietly gathered additional information about the massacre, taking accounts from men involved, and concluded there was indeed Mormon involvement. Reportedly, Young expressed deep sorrow over the tragedy, but ultimately declared it as fate. He had defended Mormon involvement for years, but public pressure demanded a responsible party. So, who would pay? Brigham Young was the leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He spent years giving intense sermons that helped shape the us versus them mentality, talked about declaring martial law, which he did end up doing just days after the massacre. Or what of the leaders in southern Utah? Did they truly take matters into their own hands, act out of greed or apocalyptic deliverance? In the end, blame would fall on the few. In 1870, Brigham Young excommunicated John D. Lee and Isaac C. Haight from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for what he called extreme wickedness. Excommunication to the saints would potentially be a fate worse than death. It was an othering, an eternal sentence worse than hell. Isaac Haight vanished from public life. John D. Lee grew bitter. Through his diaries, Lee seemed to spot correctly that responsibility was narrowing and that he was being positioned as the scapegoat. Though, with hindsight, it's easier to see that the Paiutes were the real scapegoats here, and true to fashion for those blamed in history, their voices were rarely recorded and their version of events were largely ignored. But the excommunications weren't enough to absolve the LDS Church in the eyes of the public, so pressure and condemnation remained. It was clear the American public wanted justice. In 1874, 9 men were indicted: Lee, Haight, Higby, Dame, Klingensmith, and others. Most had been living in hiding for years, and bounties were offered for the fugitives. But to fully go after all 9 men would prove to be too difficult. There would be backlash, evidence was difficult, witnesses weren't cooperating, some remained at large, one died, and one turned state evidence. Philip Klingensmith was a bishop in Cedar City who participated at Mountain Meadows. He was privy to the planning and execution of the false truce, and he gave his testimony in exchange for immunity. So, despite the involvement of dozens of men, only one would stand trial. Just like he had predicted for himself, that man was John D. Lee. Lee was charged with first-degree murder and would soon stand trial in Beaver, not far from Cedar City, the place where much of the orchestration took place. Most of the jurors were Mormon, and the sentiment around the case was unbelievably complicated. They had instruction from their prophet to not cooperate. They may have felt it was their religion on trial. The defendant was an excommunicated member, but to the public, he represented the Mormon community. The prosecution was led by Sumner Howard, who faced monumental challenges, much of which I just mentioned. Witnesses were evasive, accounts varied, most involved were going off of Brigham Young's orders to not comply with federal demands, not to mention the oaths of secrecy that were taken. What remained were fragments, conflicting testimony, secondhand accounts, and memories dulled by time or denial. Part of the defense team was Wells Spicer. He made an appearance in episode 5 of the Tombstone Blood Feud. That event would be many years later, but in this timeline, he was representing John D. Lee, who initially wanted to represent himself. But Spicer portrayed Lee as a loyal servant, scapegoated by higher powers. He insisted he acted under orders, casting blame toward Isaac Haight and other militia leaders. His defense rested as much on local sympathies as it did on the lack of hard evidence. Testimony was given by Klingensmith and James Hamblin, who helped locate the children. Even Brigham Young sent an affidavit stating he did not order any violence, he ordered peace, and that he knew nothing of the events until after the fact. Despite the testimony, the guilt of John D. Lee could not be agreed upon. It was a hung jury. Which really didn't come as a surprise. Mormon influence still ran deep in Utah's legal system, and few were willing to convict a man who had once stood as a pillar of their own community, even for a crime as heinous as Mountain Meadows. The survivors did not testify themselves, but some began to speak publicly about their experience. Much like this account from Sephrana Huff, given in the Dardanelle Independent, a newspaper in Arkansas. This was around the time of the trial. She made a public statement saying who she was, where she came from, before the ill-fated train bound for California collided with the people of southern Utah. She was 4 years old and had memories of passing through Salt Lake and a small prairie. She would recall waking to gunfire, how they assumed they were being attacked by Indians, the siege and the white flag, the promise of safe passage to Cedar City. Then the killing. This is an excerpt. I saw my mother shot in the forehead and fall dead. The woman and the children screamed and clung together. Some of the young women begged the assassins after they had run out on us not to kill them, but they had no mercy on them, clubbing them with their guns and beating out their brains. Some of the murderers were white men, and some, I supposed, were Indian from their dress. She continues with her account of there actually being 18 children, but men deciding that the 10 or 12-year-old girl was too old and could tell, so they killed her. She confirmed she was not taken by the Paiutes, but by a white man named John Willis. This is more of her account. John Willis had in his family bedclothes, clothing, and many other things that I recognized as having belonged to my mother. When I claimed the things, they told me I was a liar and tried to make me believe it was the Indians that killed her and plundered our people. But I knew better because I recollected seeing them kill our folk and knew many things that they carried off that I saw in their possessions afterward. I saw Willis during the massacre. He carried me off from the spot. I could not be mistaken. Living with him made me know him beyond a doubt. I saw them shoot the girl after we were gathered up. I had a sister that was nearly grown and 4 brothers that they killed. I was the youngest child of our family, the only one that was spared. They kept all the children separated whilst we remained with them. The scenes and incidents of the massacre were so terrible that they were indelibly stamped on my mind, notwithstanding I was so young at the time. While the trial ended without a verdict, the case was far from over. Federal authorities were determined to try again. Lee was arrested again the following year. The second trial was in September of 1876, with an all-Mormon jury this time. The first trial may have seemed like a broader conspiracy to the jury. Now they narrowed in on Lee. And by now, the political climate had changed. Federal authority was pressing harder on Utah. People were more willing to comply with their statements and be a part of the legal system versus the church's influence. Witnesses gave more detail. Clansmith described the meticulous plannings, the manipulation of the native allies, and the calculated deceit used to lure the emigrants to their deaths. Lee's defense remained steadfast. He claimed he had only acted under orders, a loyal soldier carrying out the will of his superiors. This time, Lee was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He chose death by firing squad. Would this finally be the blood atonement so many had spoken about? It may seem shocking that even though the very church that John D. Lee loved was turning against him, he could not bring himself to accuse the prophet Brigham Young. There are more ways to die than a physical death, and implicating higher church officials would go against his faith. On March 23rd of 1877, Lee was taken back to Mountain Meadows, 20 years after the massacre. He sat inside a wooden coffin, facing the execution squad, as a large crowd watched. In his final moments, Lee remained composed. He gave a short speech declaring himself a scapegoat used to appease the government. He asked God to receive his soul and refused a blindfold. The firing squad sprayed John D. Lee with bullets. He fell backwards into his coffin and to his death. He became the only person ever held legally accountable for the slaughter of the Baker-Fancher party. In the aftermath of Lee's execution, the LDS Church began to carefully curate its distance from the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Publicly, church leaders cemented that the atrocity was the work of rogue actors, a grim episode carried out by a few overzealous and misguided individuals and Paiutes retaliating. In this version, it was not reflective of Mormon doctrine or leadership, but rather a tragic anomaly, just a product of local panic and confusion during a tense chapter in frontier history. Brigham Young, who had been governor, prophet, and commander-in-chief of the Nauvoo Legion, died just months after Lee's execution. He left a complicated legacy that is still debated to this day. As time passed from the 1870s into the 1880s and onward, the church was focused on their institutional survival. Federal scrutiny still lingered over polygamy, statehood, and theocracy. And these perceptions delayed Utah's statehood, which would not come until 1896, when the church officially or publicly renounced polygamy in 1890. Utah had to demonstrate its loyalty to the nation, and distancing itself from both plural marriage and the memory of Mountain Meadows was part of that effort. Yet the emotional distance between the connected people of Arkansas and Utah remained wide. While both communities shared pioneer hardships, their views of what happened in 1857 and what it meant remained largely unreconciled. Even 40 years after the massacre, there was still more to be said by survivors. In 1897, Rebecca Dunlap Evans, one of the child survivors, gave a detailed public account of what she remembered. She had been about 6 years old at the time. Her younger sisters, Louisa and Sarah, survived with her. This was published in a local newspaper, and she ended up describing the events much like the others. She recalled hiding among the sagebrush, hearing her infant sister crying. She ran out of cover only to find the tiny baby wounded, laying in their dead mother's arms. She saved her sister's life by scooping her in her arms and running back to relative safety, though her baby sister had been shot through the arm and would never have full use of it. Rebecca's story reflected how the massacre lived on in Arkansas, while among Mormon communities, the topic became taboo. Speaking of the event would be something to avoid in conversation, and any interest in it would be a marker of a troublemaker. It wouldn't be until 1932 that the site of Mountain Meadows would receive some acknowledgement. A memorial wall was built on the site and managed by the Utah Pioneers Trails and Landmarks Association. By the early to mid 20th century, the average member of the church would more than likely see Paiute involvement as the main point of the topic, if they even heard about it at all. But that began to change in 1950 when historian Juanita Brooks, herself a faithful member of the LDS Church, published a book that would quietly shake the foundations of Mormon historical memory. Her book, The Mountain Meadows Massacre, challenged the long standing myth that Paiute tribesmen were the driving force of the event. Brooks didn't accuse Brigham Young directly, but she didn't shy away from implicating Mormon militia members or from exposing the subsequent cover up orchestrated by local church figures. She laid bare the facts, and at the time of publication, she faced backlash from within her own faith community. But her scholarship was undeniable, and over the decades, it slowly chipped away at the church's defensive stance. By the 1990s, the conversation was evolving. Descendants of the Baker Fancher Party, representatives of the Paiute tribe, and Mormon leaders came together to dedicate a new memorial at Mountain Meadows. The LDS Church's president at the time, Gordon B. Hinckley, gave a somber speech. He expressed deep sorrow, describing the massacre as a terrible chapter in Mormon history. To some, his statement was a meaningful step forward. To others, especially descendants of the victims, it may have fallen short, lacking the clear moral reckoning they hoped for. In the following years, with the rise of the internet, interest about the Mountain Meadows Massacre has only increased. People have found themselves rehashing the discrepancies between fact, fiction, and cover up. Off of the internet, there are many deeply researched books, and I'll link a few of those in the show notes. In the year 2011, the U.S. federal government designated Mountain Meadows a National Historic Landmark. The site, nestled in a quiet valley of southern Utah, had transformed. Once a killing field and then a symbol of buried shame, it is now carefully tended to. Today, you can visit Mountain Meadows and see the space of high desert where we can only imagine what it must have been like for the Baker Fancher Party. Descendants on all sides of the tragedy have tried to reconcile their history. An example of this is a poem written by Stuart Lee Udall, a U.S. politician and a descendant of John D. Lee. In 1990, he wrote this poem. There was a massacre in these hills. 4 generations have come and gone. But the deed that haunted the children, that haunted the lives of the militiamen, hovers over the silent land. Now descendants of the slain and sons and daughters of the slaves come arm in arm to end the tragic story. To share a burial rite, perform a ceremony of atonement, but how to cleanse the stained earth, to erase old griefs and grievances, to quench long dying embers of anger, to forgive unforgivable acts. The balm they bring is love, the only ointment God offers to heal wounds too deep for healing. This was True Crime of the Historical Kind. Thank you so much for sticking with me. Next week will be an all-new series, so until next time, bye.